The voicemail came through at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, interrupting my lunch break at the law firm where I worked as a paralegal. The voice was unfamiliar, a woman who identified herself as Linda Carlson, an attorney from a small town called Millbrook, about 3 hours north of Chicago. She said she needed to speak with me urgently about a client of hers, a man named Henry Sullivan, who was in hospice care and had specifically requested my presence. The message was professional, but carried an undertone of urgency that made my stomach clench. I didn't know anyone named Henry Sullivan. I'd never been to Millbrook, and yet she'd found my number somehow and left this cryptic message asking me to call back as soon as possible. My name is Rachel Porter, and I'm 26 years old. I've been on my own since I was 17, when I left my last foster home the day I graduated high school. I put myself through community college, working nights at a diner, then transferred to a state university where I juggled 3 part-time jobs to cover what my scholarships didn't. I graduated with a degree in criminal justice, thinking I might go to law school someday, but the debt scared me off. Instead, I found work at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized law firm in downtown Chicago, filing paperwork and doing research for attorneys who barely remembered my name. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my bills and gave me health insurance, which felt like winning the lottery compared to where I'd started. Growing up in the foster system teaches you not to get your hopes up about anything. You learn that people leave, that promises get broken, and that the only person who'll really look out for you is yourself. I'd been in 7 different homes between the ages of 9 and 17 after my mother died in a car accident, and no relatives came forward to claim me. The official story was that she'd been estranged from her family, that there was bad blood and old wounds that never healed. I grew up believing I was completely alone in the world, that whatever family I might have once had wanted nothing to do with me. After a while, I stopped wondering about them. It hurt less that way. But this phone call had rattled something loose inside me. I sat in the break room, staring at my half-eaten sandwich, replaying the message 3 more times. Linda Carlson had said Henry Sullivan was dying and that he'd been asking for me by name. Not just Rachel Porter, but Rachel Ann Porter, including the middle name I rarely used except on official documents. How did a dying farmer in some town I'd never heard of know my full name? Why would he ask for me? The questions spun through my mind like a carousel that wouldn't stop. I called the number back during my afternoon break. Linda answered on the second ring, and I could hear the relief in her voice when I identified myself. "Thank you for calling back so quickly," she said. "I know this must seem strange, but Mr. Sullivan has been quite insistent about seeing you. He doesn't have much time left, perhaps a few days at most, and he's expressed that speaking with you is extremely important to him." When I pressed her for details about who this man was and why he wanted to see me, she hesitated. "I think it would be better if Mr. Sullivan explained that himself," she said carefully. "But I can tell you that he's 81 years old. He's lived in Millbrook his entire life, and he owns a farm here that's been in his family for 4 generations. He has no living children, no wife, and as far as we knew, no other family, until last week when he told me about you." The words hung in the air between us. No other family. Until you. I felt something crack open in my chest. Some door I'd welded shut years ago. "Are you saying he's related to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda paused again, and I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. "I think you should come and speak with him, Rachel. He has things he needs to tell you, and honestly, I think you deserve to hear them directly from him. I've arranged for him to stay at Millbrook Hospice Center rather than the hospital. It's more comfortable, and they're equipped to handle his care. If you can come, I'd suggest doing it soon. Time is not on our side here." I told my boss I had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie, even though I wasn't sure yet what this actually was. He barely looked up from his computer as he waved me away, telling me to take whatever time I needed. By 6 p.m., I was on the road heading north, my overnight bag thrown hastily in the back seat, my mind racing faster than my car. The drive took me through the suburbs and then out into increasingly rural landscapes, fields of corn stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Millbrook turned out to be one of those small towns that time seemed to have forgotten, with a main street that couldn't have been more than 4 blocks long, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a general store, and a church with a white steeple. The hospice center was on the edge of town, a modest single-story building with a well-maintained garden out front. I pulled into the parking lot at 9:23 p.m., sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to gather my courage, and then finally forced myself to walk through those doors. Linda Carlson was waiting for me in the small reception area, exactly as she'd promised. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and glasses perched on her nose. She wore slacks and a cardigan despite the warm evening, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and reassuring. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes searching my face with an intensity that made me wonder what she was looking for. "Mr. Sullivan will be so relieved. He's been asking about you every hour since I called. The nurses say he's been fighting to stay alert, refusing pain medication that might make him drowsy because he wants to be clear-headed when you arrive." She led me down a quiet hallway, our footsteps muffled by industrial carpet. The hospice was peaceful in a way that felt intentional, with soft lighting and watercolor paintings of pastoral scenes on the walls. It didn't smell like a hospital, more like someone's home with hints of lavender and fresh air circulation. We passed several rooms with doors partially open, and I caught glimpses of families gathered around beds, saying goodbyes that probably felt both too soon and long overdue. My heart hammered in my chest, and I realized my palms were sweating. I wiped them on my jeans, suddenly very aware that I was about to meet a stranger who might somehow be family. Linda paused outside room 112. "Before we go in, I need to prepare you," she said gently. "Henry has terminal pancreatic cancer. He's lost a considerable amount of weight, and the disease has progressed rapidly over the past few months. He was still working his farm up until 6 weeks ago, refusing to admit he was sick, but eventually the pain became too much." She touched my arm lightly. "He's a proud man, Rachel, a stubborn man, but he's also been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and I think he's ready to set it down." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she opened the door. The man in the bed looked ancient and fragile, his body barely making an impression under the white blankets. His skin had a yellowish tint that I'd later learn was from his failing liver, and his face was all sharp angles and hollows. But when his eyes opened and found mine, they were the same deep brown as my own, and I felt recognition slam into me like a freight train. Those were my eyes looking back at me from that weathered face. Those were my mother's eyes too, the ones I only knew from the single photograph I had of her. "Rachel," he breathed, his voice rough and papery. "Lord have mercy, you look just like her, just like my Catherine." Tears streamed down his face, following the deep creases and pooling in the hollow of his collarbone. "I thought I'd never see you again. I thought I'd die without ever telling you the truth." His hand, gnarled and spotted with age, reached toward me with trembling fingers. "Please, come closer. Let me look at you." I moved to the chair beside his bed like I was walking through water, everything happening in slow motion. My legs felt disconnected from my body, and my heart was beating so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. When I sat down, he took my hand in both of his, and despite his frailty, his grip was desperate, like he was afraid I might vanish if he let go. "I'm your grandfather," he said, each word clearly costing him effort. "Your mother Catherine was my only child, and you're all I have left of her. I've known where you were all these years, Rachel. I've watched from a distance, making sure you were safe, but I never came for you, and that's the greatest sin of my life." The words didn't make sense. I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. "If you knew where I was, why didn't you come?" I whispered. "Why did you leave me in foster care?" I was 9 years old when my mom died. I was alone. I needed family. The anger surprised me, bubbling up from somewhere deep that I'd thought I'd buried years ago. Tears were streaming down my face now too, hot and bitter. Henry closed his eyes, and fresh tears leaked from beneath his eyelids. "Pride," he said simply. "Stupid, foolish pride and a stubbornness that cost me everything that mattered. When your mother was 18, she fell in love with a boy from town, your father, James Porter. He was a good kid, worked at the auto shop, had dreams of opening his own garage someday. But I didn't think he was good enough for my Catherine. I had plans for her, wanted her to go to college, marry someone with prospects, stay close to the farm. We fought about it constantly. The arguments would shake the whole house, with me yelling about how she was throwing her life away, and her screaming back that I didn't understand real love." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. Linda stepped forward with a glass of water, helping him sip through a straw before he continued. "When she told me she was pregnant with you, I gave her an ultimatum: leave him and come home, or leave my house and never come back. I thought I was doing the right thing, thought I was protecting her from making a terrible mistake." He laughed bitterly, a sound that turned into a cough. "She chose love. She chose your father. And I was too proud to back down, too stubborn to admit I was wrong. So I told her if she walked out that door, she was no longer my daughter. The story was unfolding like a tragedy. I couldn't stop watching. Catherine and James had moved to Chicago, where you were born," Henry continued. "They struggled financially, but they were happy, at least for a while. I kept tabs on them through a private investigator, something I'm not proud of, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know she was okay, even if I was too pig-headed to reach out and tell her so. Then, when you were 7, James was killed in a workplace accident. Faulty equipment at the garage where he worked. Your mother was devastated, and the financial situation went from difficult to desperate. If you're connecting with this story and want to hear what happens next, please hit that subscribe button below. I share real stories about family, loss, and the unexpected ways our lives can change in an instant. Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw your past? I'd love to hear your experiences. Now, let me tell you what happened after that tragedy struck Rachel's mother. Henry's breathing had become more labored, and Linda stepped forward to adjust his oxygen levels. He waved her away impatiently, clearly determined to finish his story despite the physical toll it was taking. "After James died, Catherine tried to make it work," he continued, his voice growing weaker. "She took 2 jobs, then 3, trying to keep a roof over your heads and food on the table. I knew all of this. I sat in my farmhouse reading the investigators' reports, knowing my daughter was struggling, knowing my granddaughter existed, and I did nothing. I told myself she'd made her choice, that she could come back any time if she was willing to admit I'd been right. God forgive me, I was waiting for her to apologize." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, directed entirely at himself. I sat frozen, my hand still in his, trying to reconcile the image of my mother that I'd carried all these years with this new information. I'd always imagined her as someone fragile, someone who couldn't handle the world, but Henry was describing a fighter, a woman who chose love over comfort and worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her child, for me. "She never came back," Henry said, "never called, never wrote, and I was too stubborn to be the one to reach out first. Then, when you were 9, the investigator called me with news that changed everything. Catherine had been driving home from her night shift at a warehouse. It was 3 a.m. She'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, and she fell asleep at the wheel. The car went off the road and hit a tree. She died instantly." His voice broke completely, and he sobbed, his whole body shaking with the force of his grief. "My baby girl died believing I didn't love her. She died alone, exhausted, struggling, and I could have helped her at any time. I could have swallowed my pride and brought both of you home. I felt something inside me shift and crack. All these years, I'd believed my mother had no family who wanted her, that we'd been truly alone in the world. But the truth was so much more complicated and so much more painful. We'd been alone because of one man's stubborn pride, because my grandfather couldn't admit he was wrong. The anger that surged through me was hot and immediate, but it was tangled up with grief for the mother I barely remembered and for the grandfather I'd never known I had. After she died, Henry continued, his eyes pleading with me to understand. I wanted to come for you. I swear I did. I drove to Chicago, sat outside the social services building for hours, trying to work up the courage to walk in and claim you. But I was 56 years old, single, living alone on a farm with no experience raising children. And more than that, I was terrified. What if you hated me? What if they told me I wasn't fit to take you? What if I failed you the way I'd failed your mother? So I convinced myself you'd be better off with a nice young family, people who knew how to be parents, who could give you the life you deserved. Linda had moved to the corner of the room, giving us privacy but staying close in case Henry needed medical intervention. I could see her wiping her own eyes, clearly affected by the confession unfolding before her. Henry squeezed my hand tighter. I made sure you were taken care of financially, he said. Every foster family you stayed with received additional money, anonymous donations that covered your expenses, and then some. I paid for your college education through a scholarship fund I set up. I've been watching over you from a distance, making sure you had what you needed. But I knew money wasn't what you really needed. You needed family. You needed to know you weren't alone. And I was too much of a coward to give you that. The revelation about the money stunned me. I'd received a scholarship my junior year of college that had covered my tuition and living expenses, a fund called the Sullivan Educational Foundation. I'd never questioned it, just felt grateful that someone believed in students like me. Now I understood. My grandfather had been there all along, hidden in the shadows, trying to help in the only way he knew how, while denying us both the relationship we could have had. I don't expect you to forgive me, Henry said, his voice barely audible now. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know the truth before I die. I needed you to know that your mother loved you more than anything in this world. She sacrificed everything for you, and her strength and her courage came from a love so fierce it defied everything, even her stubborn old father. And I need you to know that even though I failed you both in every way that mattered, you've never been alone. I've carried you both in my heart every single day. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the hum of medical equipment and Henry's labored breathing. I looked at this dying man, my grandfather, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't begin to sort out. Anger, grief, loss for all the years we could have had together, and underneath it all, a desperate sadness for how pride and fear had stolen so much from all of us. My mother had died, believing her father had rejected her. I'd grown up believing I had no one, and Henry had lived for 17 years, with the weight of his mistakes crushing him. Why now? I finally asked. Why reach out now after all this time? Henry's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a desperate need for some kind of redemption, however small. Because I'm dying, he said simply, and because I realized that letting you go through life believing you were unwanted and alone would be one more sin to add to all the others. You deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know that you come from people who loved fiercely, even if they loved imperfectly. And because I have something I need to give you, something that should have been yours all along. Linda stepped forward then, producing a worn leather folder from her briefcase. With Henry's permission, she said, I'd like to explain some legal matters. Mr. Sullivan has named you as his sole heir, Rachel. The farm, the house, all of his assets. Everything goes to you. We've had the paperwork prepared for the past 3 weeks, just waiting for you to arrive so we could explain everything properly. She set the folder on the bedside table and pulled out several documents. The property consists of 160 acres of farmland. The main house, which was built in 1898, a barn, and various outbuildings. There's also a savings account with approximately $340,000, the result of decades of careful management and simple living. The numbers were so staggering, I couldn't process them. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck my entire adult life, sometimes choosing between groceries and utilities, and now this stranger who was my grandfather was telling me I was inheriting a farm and more money than I'd ever imagined having. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. "I don't know anything about farming," I said weakly. "I work in a law office in Chicago. I live in a studio apartment. I've never even seen a real farm up close." Henry managed a weak smile. "The land is currently leased to a neighboring farmer, a young man named David Chen, who's been working it for the past 3 years since I couldn't manage it anymore. He pays fair rent and takes good care of the soil. You could continue that arrangement, or you could sell the property if you wanted. But the house, Rachel, the house is what I really want you to have. It's full of your history, your mother's childhood, generations of our family. There are photo albums, your mother's belongings that I kept all these years, things I should have given you long ago." His voice was fading, and I could see exhaustion pulling at him. Linda noticed too, and gently suggested that perhaps we should let Henry rest, but he shook his head with surprising vigor. "Not yet," he insisted. "I need to tell her about the letters. Rachel, in the house, in your mother's old bedroom, there's a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside are letters, dozens of them, that I wrote to Catherine over the years after she left. I never sent them. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time something reminded me of her, I'd write a letter telling her how much I missed her, how sorry I was, how I wished I could take back my harsh words. I kept thinking someday I'd be brave enough to send them, or better yet, to drive to Chicago and deliver them in person. But I never did. The image of my grandfather sitting alone in his farmhouse, writing letters to a daughter who would never read them, broke something in me. Those wasted years, all that love trapped behind walls of pride and fear. How many times had my mother cried herself to sleep missing her father? How many times had she wished for reconciliation that never came? And how different would my life have been if Henry had found his courage just a few years earlier? "There are letters for you too," he continued, his words coming slower now, each one requiring visible effort. "I started writing to you after your mother died, telling you about the farm, about your mother's childhood, about our family history, explaining why I made the choices I made, even though I knew they were wrong, apologizing over and over for not being the grandfather you deserved." His eyes were closing now, his grip on my hand loosening. "Promise me you'll read them. Promise me you'll know that even though I failed you, you were loved. You were always loved." "I promise," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The words felt inadequate for the enormity of the moment, but they were all I had. Henry's face relaxed, some of the tension that had been holding him together finally releasing. Linda moved quickly to check his vital signs, and I saw concern flash across her face. "He needs to rest now," she said firmly. "Rachel, there's a guest room down the hall where you can stay tonight. I suggest you get some sleep. We can handle all the legal details tomorrow. But right now, Henry needs to conserve his strength." I didn't want to leave. Despite everything, despite the complicated tangle of emotions, this was my grandfather, the only blood family I had left in the world, and he was dying. But Linda was insistent, and I could see that Henry had slipped into sleep, his breathing slightly easier now that he'd unburdened himself of his secrets. I stood reluctantly, but before I left the room I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "It's going to be okay," I told him, not sure if he could hear me. "I'm here now. You're not alone." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a single bed and a window overlooking the hospice garden. I lay awake most of the night, my mind spinning with everything I'd learned. I had a grandfather. I had family history. I had a mother who'd loved me so much she'd sacrificed everything, who'd chosen me over comfort and security. The version of myself I'd carried for so long, the orphan with no roots and no belonging, was crumbling away, replaced by something I didn't quite know how to hold yet. At 4:17 in the morning, there was a soft knock on my door. I knew before Linda spoke what she was going to say. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," she said gently. "Henry passed away about 10 minutes ago. It was peaceful. The nurse said he seemed to let go once he knew you'd received his message. He'd been holding on, waiting for you, and once he'd told you the truth, he could finally rest. I followed her back to his room, where his body lay still and quiet, finally free from pain. His face looked younger somehow, the deep lines of suffering smoothed away. I sat beside him for over an hour, holding his cooling hand, grieving for the grandfather I'd just found and immediately lost, for all the years we could have had together, for my mother who died never knowing her father's regret. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small Methodist church on Millbrook's main street. I was shocked to discover that the entire town seemed to turn out for it. The church was packed with farmers in their Sunday best, elderly women who'd known Henry their whole lives, and younger families whose parents and grandparents had been his neighbors. Person after person approached me to share stories about my grandfather, painting a picture of a man I'd never had the chance to know. They told me about his generosity, how he'd quietly helped struggling families during hard times, how he'd mentored young farmers and shared his equipment with neighbors who couldn't afford their own. They spoke of his stubbornness too, but with affection, calling him ornery and set in his ways, but good to his core. One elderly woman named Dorothy gripped my hands with surprising strength. "Your grandfather talked about you," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "He never said you were his granddaughter, just called you his girl in the city. But we all knew there was someone he was keeping track of, someone he cared about deeply, but couldn't quite reach. I think it ate at him every day." After she walked away, I stood in the church reception hall, surrounded by strangers who'd known my grandfather better than I ever would, and I felt the weight of lost time crushing my chest. The following week, Linda drove me out to the farm for the first time. We turned off the main highway onto a gravel road that wound through fields of soybeans and corn, then through a grove of old oak trees that created a canopy overhead. When the house came into view, my breath caught. It was a beautiful 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, black shutters, and a stone chimney rising from one side. The paint was peeling in places, and some of the porch boards looked questionable, but the bones of the house were solid, and the setting was absolutely stunning. Behind it stood a massive red barn, and beyond that, fields stretched to the horizon under an impossibly blue sky. "This is yours now," Linda said softly as we climbed out of the car. "All of it. Rachel, I know this is overwhelming, and I know you have a life in Chicago. But I hope you'll at least take some time to go through the house before you make any decisions about what to do with the property. Henry wanted you to see where your mother grew up, to understand your roots. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and dust, and something faintly floral that might have been sachets in drawers. The furniture was outdated but well-maintained, and every surface held evidence of a life lived: books on farming techniques, stacks of agricultural magazines, framed photographs of people I didn't recognize. Linda led me upstairs to a bedroom at the end of the hall, and when she opened the door, I felt like I'd stepped back in time. The room was frozen in approximately 1989, with posters of bands I vaguely recognized from oldies stations, a bookshelf full of young adult novels, and a desk with a lamp shaped like a horse. "This was your mother's room," Linda explained. "Henry never changed it. I think he kept hoping she'd come back someday." At the foot of the bed was the wooden chest he'd mentioned, dark walnut with brass hinges. I knelt beside it with trembling hands and lifted the lid. The letters were organized in bundles tied with string, labeled by year. I pulled out the first bundle, dated from the year my mother left home, and began to read. Henry's handwriting was surprisingly elegant, and his words were raw with emotion. He wrote about missing her laugh, about walking past her empty bedroom and feeling the absence like a physical wound. He wrote about his regrets, about things he wished he'd said differently, about wanting to meet his granddaughter. Each letter ended the same way, "With love always, your father," and each one had never been sent. I spent 3 days at the farm, barely sleeping, reading through years of letters. Henry had documented everything: his daily life on the farm, memories of raising Catherine, stories about my great-grandparents and the history of the land. He'd written to me too, dozens of letters, starting from when I was 9 years old, telling me about the farm, about what my mother had been like as a child, about how much he wished he could be part of my life. In one letter written when I was 16, he'd included a newspaper clipping about a writing contest I'd won at school. "I'm so proud of you," he'd written. "You have your mother's gift with words. She used to write the most beautiful poetry. I wish I'd told her that more often." In the bottom of the chest, I found photo albums documenting my mother's childhood. There she was, at age 5, missing her front teeth and grinning at the camera. At 12, sitting on a horse and looking confident and free. At 16, beautiful and bright-eyed, standing in front of the barn with her arms spread wide, like she could embrace the whole world. And there were photos of her with my father too, candid shots that Henry must have gotten from the private investigator. My parents looking young and in love, holding me as a baby, the three of us forming a family that should have been embraced instead of rejected. I found myself walking the property every evening as the sun set, trying to imagine my mother running through these fields as a child, climbing the oak trees, helping with harvest. This land held my history, roots I'd never known I had. The enormity of what Henry had given me, not just the property, but the knowledge of where I came from, was staggering. I'd spent my whole life believing I was alone, unconnected, floating through the world without anchor. But I'd been wrong. I came from farmers and dreamers, from stubborn men and fierce women, from people who loved imperfectly but deeply. 2 weeks after the funeral, I gave notice at my job in Chicago. My boss was surprised, but understanding. I put my apartment up for sublease and started packing up my life, which fit into surprisingly few boxes. I was 26 years old, and I was moving to a small farming town to live in my grandfather's house and figure out who I was supposed to be now that I knew where I came from. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The first night I spent alone in the farmhouse. I sat on the front porch as twilight settled over the fields. Fireflies danced in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the low of cattle from a neighboring farm. I thought about Henry, sitting in this same spot, writing letters he never sent, carrying the weight of his mistakes for 17 years. I thought about my mother, who'd been brave enough to choose love over security, who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to give me a good life. And I thought about the version of myself I'd been just a month ago, lonely and disconnected, believing I had no place in the world that was truly mine. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. If Henry could write letters to people who couldn't read them, I could talk to ghosts who couldn't answer. "Mom," I began, my voice cracking slightly. "Grandpa Henry, I wish things had been different. I wish pride and stubbornness hadn't stolen so much time from all of us. But I want you to know I'm here now. I'm going to take care of this place, preserve the history, honor the sacrifices." I paused, wiping my eyes. "And I'm going to live the kind of life that makes all your struggles worthwhile. I'm going to be brave like you, Mom. And I'm going to learn from Grandpa's mistakes. I'm going to tell people I love them while they can still hear it. I'm going to choose connection over pride, every single time." Over the following months, I threw myself into learning about the farm and restoring the house. David Chen, the farmer who leased the land, became a friend and mentor, teaching me about crop rotation and soil management. I started a blog, documenting my journey from city paralegal to rural farm owner, and to my surprise, it gained a following. People responded to the story of discovering family and roots, of learning that you're never as alone as you think you are. I started taking photographs of farm life, capturing the beauty in ordinary moments, the way my mother had once captured the world in her poetry. I found a box in the attic containing my mother's journals and poetry, writings I'd never known existed. Her words were beautiful and heartbreaking, full of love for my father and for me, but also full of longing for the father who'd rejected her. I cried for days reading them, grieving for all three of us and the family we should have been. But I also found strength in her words, in her determination to build a life on her own terms, despite the cost. The farmhouse became my sanctuary and my project. I repainted every room, refinished the hardwood floors, and modernized the kitchen while keeping its vintage charm. I turned my mother's old bedroom into a writing space where I worked on the novel I'd been putting off for years. The story poured out of me, fueled by everything I'd learned about love and loss and the complicated ways families break and heal. Henry's sewing room, I discovered he'd taken up quilting after Catherine left, became a guest room for the friends from Chicago who visited and fell in love with the peaceful rhythm of farm life. The house filled with life again, with laughter and conversation and the smell of cooking, things it had been missing for too long. A year after Henry's death, I organized a memorial gathering at the farm, inviting everyone who'd known him. We planted an oak tree in his honor, its roots going deep into the soil he'd tended for decades. Dorothy brought old photographs of Henry as a young man, strong and vital, working the fields with his father. Looking at those images, I could see echoes of my own face, the shape of my jaw, the set of my eyes, connections that stretched back through generations. I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. I just hadn't known where to look. Standing under that oak tree, surrounded by people who'd become my community, I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd carried toward Henry for his mistakes had transformed into something gentler, a sadness for time lost, but also gratitude for the gift he'd ultimately given me. He'd spent his last days ensuring I would know the truth, that I would understand I came from love, even when that love had been expressed imperfectly. In his own broken way, he'd tried to make things right. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me that you've taken this journey with me through family secrets, heartbreak, and ultimately coming home to a place I never knew I belonged. If this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel. I share real stories about the messy, beautiful, complicated ways families shape us, lose us, and sometimes find us again. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Have you struggled with forgiveness, either giving it or receiving it? What did this story teach you about the importance of swallowing our pride and reaching out while we still have time? Your stories and insights help build a community where we can all feel a little less alone. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to come home, and sometimes the family we thought we'd lost has been waiting for us all along.